Picture this: a Viking longship slicing through the icy mist of the North Atlantic, its dragon-headed prow gliding silently over the waves. The air is thick with salt and the promise of the unknown. These weren't just raiders in horned helmets, though, spoiler alert, they never actually wore those. They were explorers, inventors, and storytellers whose secrets have been buried for centuries. We think we know the Vikings, but what if everything you've been told is only half the story? Behind the legends of bloodshed and conquest lies a world of astonishing sophistication. Did you know the Vikings navigated using sunstones, crystals that could pinpoint the sun's location even on cloudy days? Or that their women held more power than in most medieval societies, with some even leading armies? For every myth you've heard, there's a truth twice as fascinating waiting to shatter it. This isn't just history, it's a puzzle, one that changes the way we see an entire era. Today, we're setting sail into the fog of time to uncover 30 secrets of the Viking Age that'll leave you questioning what you thought you knew. From their hidden trade routes that stretched farther than Rome's to the eerie rituals that bound their warriors to the gods, these aren't just footnotes, they're the untold chapters of a civilization that shaped our world. So ready your curiosity like a Viking sharpens a blade. By the end of this journey, you won't just see these seafarers as legends, you'll see them as they truly were: innovators, survivors, and masters of a world far stranger than Hollywood ever showed us. Here's the truth that might shatter your childhood image of Vikings: those fierce warriors never actually wore horned helmets. Not in battle, not in ceremonies, not ever. So where did this iconic myth come from? Blame 19th century opera. In 1876, a costume designer for Wagner's Ring Cycle slapped horns on helmets to make the Viking characters look more wild and barbaric. The dramatic flair stuck, and soon artists, advertisers, and even early filmmakers ran with the idea, cementing it in pop culture. But archaeology tells a different story. The most famous real Viking helmet ever found, the German Bu helmet dug up in Norway, is a sleek, rounded piece of iron with a simple nose guard, no horns in sight. In fact, every single Viking-era helmet discovered so far shares this practical design. Horns would have been a liability in combat, snagging on weapons or shields, and Vikings were nothing if not brutally efficient warriors. So why does the myth endure? Part of its sheer spectacle: horned helmets look intimidating, perfect for selling books, movies, and souvenirs, but there's also a deeper twist. Some historians think the confusion might stem from ceremonial headpieces worn by Norse priests centuries earlier, or even misidentified artifacts from entirely different cultures. The irony: Vikings were meticulous about their real armor, often inlaid with intricate designs, but their actual helmets were tools of war, not theater props. Next time you see a horned helmet in a movie, remember, the Vikings were too smart for that. Their real legacy isn't in flashy costumes, but in the cunning and craftsmanship that made them legends. When we think of Viking warriors, burly men with battle axes might come to mind, but history has a surprise for us. In 1878, archaeologists uncovered a lavish grave in Birka, Sweden, packed with weapons: a sword, an axe, arrows, and even 2 shields. For over a century, everyone assumed it belonged to a high-ranking male warrior. Then, in 2017, DNA testing revealed the shocking truth: the skeleton was female. This wasn't some isolated case. Norse sagas are filled with accounts of shieldmaidens, women who fought alongside men. Take Lagertha, the legendary warrior wife of Ragnar Lothbrok, who wasn't just a character from TV. She's mentioned in 13th century texts leading armies. Or the Danish chronicler Saxo Grammaticus, who wrote about women so fierce they dressed themselves to look like men, and devoted every moment of their lives to the pursuit of war. But here's what's even more fascinating: Viking women didn't just pick up swords in emergencies, they had real social power. They could inherit property, demand divorces, and even rule as chieftains. The sagas tell of Aud the Deep-Minded, who commanded her own fleet to colonize Iceland after her husband's death, and Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, who sailed to North America long before Columbus. Why does this matter? Because the stereotype of Viking women as passive homemakers is as false as those horned helmets. In a world where most medieval cultures sidelined women, Norse society gave them room to be traders, landowners, and yes, warriors. The Birka grave wasn't an anomaly. It was proof that history is far more thrilling when we let go of old assumptions. So next time someone claims Vikings were just a boys' club, remind them, their fiercest fighters might have worn braids under those helmets, not horns. We've all been taught that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492, but here's the twist. Vikings walked those shores 500 years earlier, building homes, harvesting timber, and even clashing with locals. The proof, a windswept patch of Newfoundland called Elance Ox Meadows, where archaeologists uncovered the unmistakable remains of a Norse settlement. 8 turf-walled buildings, iron nails, and a bronze cloak pin, all carbon dated to around the year 1000. This wasn't just a random landing, it was a base camp for expeditions into a land they called Vinland, named for the wild grapes that grew there. The sagas, those epic Viking oral histories written down centuries later, paint a vivid picture. Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, supposedly heard of a mysterious western land from a trader blown off course. Sailing west, he found ice-covered mountains, then a flat, forested coast, and finally Vinland, where the dew on the grass tasted as sweet as honey. But these weren't just fairy tales. In 2021, scientists used tree ring dating on wood fragments at Elance Ox Meadows to pinpoint the exact year Vikings were there, 1021. That's 471 years before Columbus even set sail. What's staggering is the scale of their voyages, from Norway to Iceland, then Greenland, and finally North America, a 2,000-mile journey across open ocean in open longboats. They had no compasses, just sunstones, stars, and an uncanny sense of the sea. Compare that to Columbus, who hugged coastlines and had detailed maps of the Caribbean before he left. Vikings didn't just stumble upon America, they chose to go repeatedly. The sagas mention at least 3 separate expeditions, including one where Ericsson's brother Thorvald was killed by indigenous archers, making him arguably the first European casualty in America's long history of conflict. So why didn't they stay? The same thing that plagued their Greenland colonies: isolation, hostile encounters, and a lack of support from back home. Vinland was too far, too risky, and by the 1200s, even Greenland's settlements had vanished. But for a brief moment, Vikings stood where Manhattan skyscrapers rise today, their boots crunching on autumn leaves in a world they couldn't yet imagine would reshape history. Columbus got the glory, but the Vikings, they got there first, and their ghostly footprints still whisper in the Newfoundland wind. Think Vikings were filthy, unwashed barbarians. Here's a secret that'll make you rethink everything. They were arguably the cleanest people in medieval Europe. While their continental neighbors often went months without bathing, believing it opened pores to disease, Vikings took hygiene so seriously they had dedicated laundry days and even bleached their hair. Archaeological digs have turned up grooming kits buried with warriors' tiny spoons for cleaning ears, finely crafted tweezers for plucking eyebrows, and carved combs made from antler or bone. These weren't just functional tools, they were personal treasures, often decorated with intricate carvings and kept in leather pouches. Take their soap, for instance. Norse recipes combined animal fat with lye from burned wood ash, creating a potent cleaning agent that could strip dirt and, unfortunately, sometimes skin. But it worked. Arabic chronicler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who encountered Vikings on the Volga River in the 10th century, noted with surprise how they washed daily, even sharing communal basins of water. Their bathing rituals were so distinctive that in England, Viking-controlled territories became known for their Lorgard dagger, literally washing day, which eventually evolved into the modern word Saturday. And let's talk about hair. Viking men and women alike bleached their locks with a strong soap mixture, not just for vanity but possibly to combat lice. Light hair was fashionable, and sagas described lovers as fair-haired like gold or sunlight, but hygiene went beyond appearances. Excavations in Dublin revealed pits full of fish bones and ashes, the remnants of lye production for both soap and preserving leather. They even had proto-detergents for laundry, pounding clothes with soap in streams to lift stains. Compare this to the rest of Europe, where the church discouraged frequent bathing, and you start to see the irony. The Vikings, so often painted as brutish invaders, might have been the only ones who didn't smell like rancid sweat and rotting wool. So next time you picture a Viking, ditch the grime-covered berserker trope. The real ones were probably cleaner than the monks who wrote about them, and definitely more stylish. The Viking Age wasn't just about exploration and conquest, it was built on a brutal economy of human bondage. Slavery was so deeply woven into Norse society that the word thrall became synonymous with enslaved people, and their trade routes stretched from the icy coast of Scandinavia to the bustling markets of Baghdad. When Viking longships appeared on the horizon, it wasn't just gold and silver they were after, it was people. Take Dublin, one of the largest slave markets of the Viking world. Founded as a Norse trading hub in the 9th century, this city became a grim crossroads where captives from Ireland, Scotland, and England were bought, sold, and shipped overseas. Irish chronicles describe towns emptied overnight, entire monasteries hauled away in chains. The Annals of Ulster recount a raid in 871 where a great spoil of women and boys and girls was taken, a chilling reminder that slavery wasn't collateral damage, it was the objective. Archaeology confirms what texts hint at. Iron shackles excavated in Norway and Sweden match descriptions of those used to restrain captives during transport. At the Viking settlement of Birka, a mass grave revealed bodies buried without grave goods, their bones showing signs of malnutrition and hard labor, likely thralls who lived and died in servitude. Even more telling are Arabic accounts. 10th century traveler Ibn Hawqal wrote of Viking merchants dragging Slavic captives to Constantinople, where they were traded for silk and silver. Some ended up as far as Samarra in modern Iraq, their pale skin and blonde hair making them exotic commodities in the Islamic world. But here's what's especially disturbing. Slavery wasn't just a Viking practice, it was their economic engine. Thralls worked farms, forged weapons, and even crewed ships, freeing up elites to raid and trade. A wealthy Norse household might have dozens, their status measured in human property. The Rigsthula, an Old Norse poem, spells it out. Thralls were the lowest caste, doomed to bear burdens and grind the quern stone, while their owners lived as kings. This isn't just ancient history, it's a legacy that reshaped cultures. Genetic studies suggest enslaved Celtic women were brought to Iceland in such numbers that today, 60% of Icelandic maternal DNA traces back to the British Isles. The Vikings didn't just take land, they took lives, weaving them into the fabric of their society. So why isn't this as infamous as their raids? Maybe because history favors the conqueror's stories. But the shackles remain, silent witnesses to a truth far darker than the sagas ever told. Imagine being lost at sea under a sky so thick with clouds that not even a sliver of sunlight breaks through, yet still knowing exactly which way to sail. For Viking navigators, this wasn't magic, it was science. They harnessed the power of sunstones, mysterious crystals that could reveal the sun's position even when it was completely hidden. Recent experiments with a mineral called calcite found in Iceland prove these weren't just legends. When polarized light passes through the crystal, it creates a double image that aligns with the sun's true location, cutting through fog, clouds, or even twilight. One artifact changed everything: the Unatok disk, a wooden fragment discovered in Greenland with notches matching the sun's path at key sailing latitudes. Paired with a sunstone, it functioned like a primitive compass. Researchers in Hungary recreated the setup using calcite under overcast conditions and found it could pinpoint the sun's position within 5 degrees. That's precise enough to guide a longship from Norway to Newfoundland without modern instruments. But here's what's truly astonishing: Vikings didn't just stumble upon this trick. They systematized it. Sagas describe navigators holding stones overhead, rotating them until light patterns matched, then marking the ship's course. This wasn't guesswork, it was repeatable empirical science. Compare that to medieval Europe, where many still believed the ocean boiled at the equator or housed sea monsters. Vikings weren't just sailing blind into the unknown, they were mastering nature's hidden rules. Why does this matter? Because it rewrites how we see their voyages. With sunstones, a cloudy day was no obstacle. They could cross the North Atlantic in any season, their ships slicing through waves while other cultures clung to coastlines. It's no accident that Vikings reached continents others feared to approach. They had tools that turned the sky itself into a map. So next time you check your GPS, remember, 1,000 years ago, someone was navigating storms with nothing but a crystal and sheer ingenuity. Few Viking legends chill the blood like the so-called blood eagle, an execution method so brutal it sounds ripped from a horror film. According to the sagas, victims were laid face down, their ribs hacked from the spine and splayed outward like wings, while their lungs were pulled from their backs to flutter like a macabre pair of bloody sails. But here's the twist: modern historians are locked in a fiery debate over whether this ritual ever actually happened. The grisliest accounts come from 2 13th-century texts. In the Orkneyinga saga, Earl Torf Einar supposedly carves a blood eagle into his enemy Halfdan Long Leg as revenge for killing his father. The Saga of the Sons of Ragnar describes Ivar the Boneless performing the ritual on King Aelle of Northumbria, who'd murdered Ivar's father, Ragnar Lothbrok, by throwing him into a snake pit. These stories drip with poetic justice, but they were written centuries after the events they describe, by authors who likely never witnessed such an act. Now the skeptic's case. No archaeological evidence of a blood eagle victim has ever been found. No skeletons with telltale rib damage, no contemporary accounts from Viking-era chroniclers. Even the sagas themselves disagree on details. Some versions claim the victim died quickly from the first incision. Others suggest they remained conscious as their lungs were extracted. This inconsistency makes some scholars argue the blood eagle was pure symbolism, a literary metaphor for the carving of the eagle, an old Norse phrase meaning to kill a rival in battle. But don't dismiss it just yet. Supporters of the blood eagle's reality point to the Vikings' well-documented flair for psychological warfare. Imagine the terror of rumors spreading through a coastal village, stories of enemies transformed into grotesque, wing-like carcasses. Whether real or not, the blood eagle served a purpose. It painted the Vikings as untouchable monsters, a reputation that could make entire kingdoms surrender without a fight. So where does the truth lie? Some historians propose a middle ground. Early medieval Europe had other brutal execution methods. Think of the Anglo-Saxons, blood pudding, torture, or the Franks' use of breaking wheels. Perhaps the blood eagle was a rare, ceremonial punishment reserved for the worst betrayals, exaggerated over time into myth. Or maybe it was never physical at all, but a dark folk tale meant to echo the eagles that feasted on battlefields, their wings stained red with blood. One thing's certain: whether fact or fiction, the blood eagle reveals how the Vikings weaponized fear. Their enemies didn't need proof, just the possibility was enough to make kings hesitate and armies falter. And in that sense, the legend worked exactly as intended, cutting deeper than any blade ever could. Sometimes history turns on the smallest moments, even a haircut. The Viking Age didn't erupt from thin air. According to legend, it started with a love-struck king and a petty rejection. Harald Fairhair, the would-be unifier of Norway, supposedly swore an oath as a young man. He wouldn't cut or comb his hair until he'd conquered all of Norway's warring kingdoms. For years, he fought with wild, tangled locks, earning the nickname Shockhead, until victory finally made him Fairhair. But here's the twist: his story might hinge on a princess's cruel joke. The saga claims Harald proposed to Jida, a rival king's daughter, only for her to scoff that she'd never marry some petty ruler with unkempt hair. Enraged, Harald vowed not just to groom himself, but to crush every rival standing in his way. By the late 9th century, he'd done it, forging Norway's first unified kingdom. But this victory had unintended consequences. Displaced nobles, unwilling to bow to Harald's rule, did what Vikings did best: they sailed away, seeking new lands to plunder and settle. Archaeology backs part of this tale. Mass graves in England and Ireland from the late 8th century right around Harald's rise suddenly show an influx of Norse weapons and artifacts. These weren't random raids, they were coordinated strikes by skilled warriors with nothing left to lose. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the first major Viking attack on Lindisfarne in 793, just as Harald's rivals were fleeing his grip. Coincidence, maybe, but the timing suggests a ripple effect: one man's ambition scattering battle-hardened nobles across Europe like shrapnel. What's fascinating is how this origin story flips the script. Vikings aren't just mindless raiders, they're political exiles turned loose by a king's stubborn pride. Even the haircut angle might have deeper meaning. Norse culture saw well-groomed hair as a sign of nobility, so Harald's transformation from wild rebel to polished ruler wasn't just personal, it was propaganda proving he'd earned his place. So did a single haircut really launch the Viking Age? Probably not. But legends like this reveal something crucial: history isn't just about battles and treaties. Sometimes it's about wounded egos, tangled hair, and the chaos that follows when proud men refuse to kneel. Beneath the clang of swords and the roar of dragon-proud longships, the Vikings carried another weapon, one as potent as any axe, yet far more tender: poetry. Skaldic verses, those intricately woven Nordic poems, weren't just about blood and glory. They pulsed with longing, desire, and heartache, revealing a side of Viking culture Hollywood rarely shows. Take this line from a 10th century love poem: "Your eyelashes gleam like the moon on water, and I am adrift, unmoored." This wasn't scribbled by some lovesick bard, it was composed by a warrior, his words as precise as his blade strokes. The contrast is striking. In one breath, a skald might recount the splintering of shields in battle. In the next, he'd spin metaphors comparing a woman's hair to golden wheat swaying in a fjord's wind. The Krakumál, a famous death poem attributed to the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, throbs with defiance: "Laughing shall I die." But dig deeper, and you'll find verses like, "I remember the scent of her hair as she braided it by firelight," a quiet moment of intimacy amid the bravado. What makes these love poems extraordinary is their structure. Skaldic poetry wasn't free-form, it was a linguistic maze of alliteration, rhyme, and cryptic metaphors called kennings. To say "woman," a poet might use "Fyrstrath, wave's path," painting her as the shore his thoughts endlessly crash upon. These weren't just flowery phrases, they were puzzles meant to dazzle listeners with their ingenuity. A well-crafted love poem could elevate a warrior's status as much as a well-fought battle. And here's the twist: many of these verses were composed by women. The Poetic Edda preserves lines like, "I dreamed of your arms around me, yet dawn tore you away," attributed to figures like Jorunn the poetess, who wielded words as skillfully as any skald. In a society where reputation was everything, poetry was currency, a way to immortalize passion, mourn loss, or even negotiate relationships. A beautifully composed verse could smooth tensions between feuding families or spark a romance across enemy lines. So why does this matter? Because it shatters the stereotype of Vikings as one-dimensional brutes. Their love poems were as layered as their swords were sharp, proof that even the fiercest warriors carried tenderness beneath their mail shirts. Next time you picture a Viking, don't just see the battle cry, hear the whisper of a skald's verse, weaving beauty into the brutal tapestry of their world. DNA doesn't lie, and it turns out the Vikings didn't just carry swords and shields across Europe. They brought cats. Genetic studies of feline remains from Viking-era sites tell a surprising story. These sleek hunters didn't just wander onto Norse ships by accident. They were deliberate travel companions, their DNA tracing a path from the Near East all the way to the Baltic, matching the routes of Viking trade networks. One particular study in 2016 analyzed cat bones from a 9th century port in Germany and found mitochondrial lineages linking them to Egyptian and Mesopotamian cats, proof that Vikings were transporting them across continents. But why practicality first? Longships stocked with grain and dried fish were a buffet for rats and mice. Cats were the perfect solution, silent, deadly, and low maintenance. A single skilled mouser could protect a winter's food supply or prevent rodents from gnawing through precious rope and leather. Archaeologists have found cat remains in Viking settlements from Dublin to Russia, often with wear patterns on their teeth suggesting a diet heavy on human scraps. These weren't strays, they were crew, yet there's a deeper layer. In Norse mythology, Freya, the goddess of love, fertility, and battle, rode a chariot pulled by two massive cats, said to be gifts from Thor. Their names, Beigel and Tiajagal, shimmer with meaning, possibly rooted in words for bee and tree, hinting at connections to nature's cycles. Farmers left offerings of milk for Freya's cats, hoping for her favor. And here's the haunting part. Excavations in Denmark and Sweden have uncovered cat skeletons buried alongside humans, some with deliberate, almost ceremonial placements. At a grave in Ledger, a young woman was interred with a cat at her feet, its bones showing no signs of butchery, just companionship reaching into the afterlife. The irony is delicious. These same people who terrified medieval Europe with raids also cherished creatures we now stuff into Instagram posts. A Viking's cat might stalk rats by day and curl by the fire at night, its purrs cutting through the cold like a skald's verse. So next time you see a cat lounging like a tiny monarch, remember, its ancestors might have crossed storms and battlefields not as pests but as partners woven into the sagas, both as protectors of ships and sacred steeds of the gods. Hollywood loves painting Vikings as towering, blue-eyed blondes, but science tells a messier, far more interesting story. Genetic studies of Viking-age skeletons reveal a surprising truth. Many had dark hair and brown eyes, with blue eyes only becoming dominant centuries later. The myth of the all-blonde Norse warrior, it's about as accurate as those horned helmets. Take the 2020 study published in Nature, where researchers analyzed over 400 Viking-era remains from Scandinavia and beyond. The DNA evidence was startling. Nearly half of the individuals studied carried genes for darker pigmentation, particularly in regions like Denmark and southern Sweden. Some even had traces of Southern European or Middle Eastern ancestry, likely from trade contacts or captured slaves absorbed into the population. One grave in particular, from a 10th century Viking burial site in Oxford, England, held the skeleton of a high-status warrior with unmistakable Nordic grave goods, but genetic analysis showed he had dark brown eyes and black hair. So how did the blonde stereotype take hold? Part of it comes from later medieval texts where Scandinavian invaders were described as fair or golden by chroniclers who may have been exaggerating their foreignness. But archaeology paints a different picture. Hair combs excavated from Viking sites often contain dark strands preserved in the metal, and dental calculus, the hardened plaque on ancient teeth, has revealed proteins linked to darker hair pigments. Even the famous Oseberg ship burial with its two elite women yielded evidence suggesting one had brown hair. The blue eye phenomenon is especially fascinating. While today Scandinavia has some of the highest rates of blue-eyed people globally, this wasn't always the case. Early Viking populations had a mix, but over time, the gene for light eyes spread, possibly because of sexual selection. Norse sagas and poetry routinely praised light eyes as a mark of beauty or divine favor, with descriptors like sky bright or fjord clear. Over generations, this cultural preference could have tipped the genetic scales. Here's the kicker: the Vikings themselves might have enhanced the blonde ideal. Historical accounts mention they used strong soap with high lye content to bleach their hair, a practice confirmed by chemical analysis of combs and grooming tools. So while not all Vikings were naturally fair, many likely made themselves blonder, either for fashion, status, or to fit the emerging archetype of the golden warrior. This isn't just about hair color, it's about how myths eclipse reality. The Viking world was diverse, from dark-haired traders in Constantinople to red-headed settlers in Iceland. Reducing them to a single look erases their complexity, turning a tapestry of cultures and genetics into a cartoon. Next time you see a Viking depicted as universally blonde and blue-eyed, remember, history's palette was always more vivid than fiction allows. Long before snowboarding or Olympic slaloms, Vikings were gliding across frozen landscapes with a skill we still rely on today: skiing. The evidence starts with 4,000-year-old rock carvings in Norway's Alta region, where stick figure hunters chase prey on long, curved planks. But Vikings didn't just inherit this ancient tradition, they perfected it. The Moskeen ski, discovered in a peat bog in northern Norway, dates to the 8th century and shows jaw-dropping craftsmanship: a 6-foot-long pine board, carefully curved at the tip to prevent sinking into powder, with leather bindings designed to strap snugly over fur-lined boots. Why were Vikings so obsessed with skiing? Survival. In a land where winter could lock settlements in ice for months, skis meant mobility. The sagas overflow with references: hunters chasing reindeer across glaciers, scouts darting between villages to deliver warnings, even warriors launching surprise attacks. One account in Heimskringla describes troops skiing down mountain passes to ambush enemies, faster than wolves. And let's not forget the legendary Ullr, the Norse god of skiing, said to glide so effortlessly he could cross entire fjords without breaking stride. His myths weren't just fantasies, they mirrored real techniques. The brilliance of Viking skis lay in their asymmetry. Archaeologists found pairs where one board was shorter and edged with animal bone to grip ice, while the longer, smoother board helped glide. This wasn't recreational, it was engineered for efficiency. Some skis even had fur strips glued to the underside. Forward strokes slid smoothly, while backward steps gripped like sandpaper, a trick modern cross-country skiers still use. But here's the kicker: skiing wasn't just practical, it was competitive. The saga of Egil Skallagrimson boasts of races where losers forfeited weapons or land. Viking-era graves have yielded skis buried like cherished heirlooms, their surfaces polished from use. Imagine a culture where mastering the art of the perfect turn could win you fame, fortune, or even a god's favor. So next time you watch the Winter Olympics, remember those athletes are riding on 4 millennia of innovation, and some of the sharpest turns in history were carved by Vikings chasing destiny, one icy slope at a time. Eric the Red didn't earn his nickname by being honest. After getting exiled from Iceland for murder, he spotted an opportunity: a vast, icy landmass to the west that earlier Norse explorers had dismissed as uninhabitable. But when he returned to Iceland to recruit settlers, he didn't call it Icy Wasteland or Barren Rock. No, he dubbed it Greenland, a name so laughably misleading it still trotted out as the first recorded example of false advertising. Here's the kicker: it worked. In 985, he led 25 ships of hopeful colonists across the treacherous Denmark Strait, promising fertile pastures and mild winters. Only 14 ships survived the journey, a grim foreshadowing of the reality awaiting them. For a while, though, the lie held. Core samples from Greenland's ice caps reveal something startling. When Eric arrived, the island was experiencing the medieval warm period, a climatic anomaly that raised temperatures just enough to make southern fjords farmable. Archaeologists have uncovered over 400 Norse homestead ruins, some with cow byres large enough for 60 cattle, proof they weren't just scraping by but thriving. At its peak, the eastern settlement boasted nearly 2,000 people with churches, bishoprics, and even walrus ivory exports to Europe. The soil, enriched by volcanic ash from Iceland, grew barley and rye while seals and caribou provided meat. But the climate giveth and the climate taketh away. By the 1300s, Greenland's luck ran out. Tree rings and ice cores tell the story. Temperatures plummeted during the Little Ice Age, shortening growing seasons and expanding pack ice that blocked trade routes. Norse farmers, stubbornly clinging to European customs, refused to adopt Inuit hunting techniques like seal blubber lamps or kayak fishing. Instead, they kept starving cattle in barns, burning precious timber for warmth as their hayfields froze. The final blow came from economics. Europe's demand for walrus ivory, Greenland's main export, collapsed when African elephant ivory became available. A last-ditch letter from a Greenlandic priest in 1424 pleads for a ship to rescue them, lamenting that no vessel has come here for 6 years. By the time a German merchant ship stumbled upon the eastern settlement in 1540, only empty stone houses remained, their doorways choked with snow. The ruins still whisper clues. At H. Valsey Church, where the last recorded Norse wedding was held in 1408, lichen-crusted walls stand eerily intact. Nearby, cow bones show signs of malnutrition, and middens reveal desperate meals of seabirds and seaweed. Greenland hadn't changed, just the climate and the Norse refusal to adapt. Eric's paradise became a lesson in how even the boldest lies can't cheat nature, and yet his name stuck. Greenland endures as a testament to the power of a well-sold story, one that lured hundreds to their doom, but cemented a legacy far colder than the glaciers that swallowed them. Buried beneath the soil of Viking-age graves and settlement ruins lie treasures that don't glitter, yet speak volumes. Miniature wooden ships, some no longer than a hand, rest beside children's skeletons or scattered in the corners of longhouses. These weren't just toys, they were tiny blueprints of destiny. In a culture where seafaring defined survival, even Viking toddlers grasped toy oars before they could walk, their games mirroring the rhythms of the adult world. The most striking example comes from a child's grave in Hedeby, where a carved ship with a serpent-headed prow was placed beside a young boy, its hull blackened from generations of play before becoming his final companion. Similar finds pepper Norse sites, a toy ship from Bergen with pegs for sail rigging, another in Dublin with a rudder that still pivots after 1,000 years. These artifacts share uncanny details, scaled-down versions of the same clinker-built planks and curved stems that made real longships so agile. Even the paint patterns match adult vessels, suggesting these weren't generic playthings but precise models, possibly used to teach navigation or ship hierarchy. What's heartbreaking is the intimacy they reveal. A toy ship found in Reykjavik's early settlement layers bears tooth marks along the gunwale, as if a child once teethed on it during chilly nights by the fire. Others show repairs, tiny holes where tiny hands reattached broken masts with twine. These weren't discardable trinkets, they were heirlooms of childhood, passed between siblings or cherished until burial. The parallels to modern toys are irresistible. Just as today's kids pilot toy spaceships or race miniature cars, Viking children reenacted the adventures of their seafaring parents. But there's a crucial difference. For them, play wasn't fantasy, it was rehearsal. Every push across a puddle mirrored a future voyage across the North Sea. Every pretend raid on a stick fort foreshadowed real battles to come. Archaeologists argue these toys also served as social equalizers. While elite children might inherit silver pendants, even thralls' kids could own toy ships carved from driftwood by fathers between fishing trips. In a society where maritime skill meant power, These humble objects were the great levelers' passports to a shared identity. So next time you see a child steering a toy boat, remember, the Vikings turned play into prophecy. Their toys weren't just distractions, they were the first whispers of a life spent chasing horizons, where every puddle was an ocean waiting to be crossed. The image of Vikings as lawless marauders couldn't be further from the truth. They built one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated legal systems, complete with democratic assemblies, memorized laws, and rituals so precise they bordered on sacred. At the heart of it all stood the Althing, Iceland's open-air parliament founded in 930, where chieftains and free men gathered annually to settle disputes, enact laws, and recite legal codes word for word. Picture this, a natural amphitheater at Thingvellir, where towering lava cliffs formed a Chinese letter megaphone, carrying the voices of law speakers across a sea of wool-clad spectators. These law speakers weren't just judges, they were human hard drives, reciting the entirety of Iceland's legal code from memory during their 3-year terms. One slip and the entire system could collapse. The process was as dramatic as any raid. Before a verdict, both accuser and accused would swear oaths on a holy ring, often kept in a temple of Thor or Freya. The ring wasn't just symbolic. Touching it during a false oath was believed to summon divine wrath. Even witnessing an oath had rules. Men had to stand while women sat, reflecting gender roles in legal testimony. Some cases required oath helpers, where up to 12 neighbors would swear alongside a defendant, their collective honor backing his innocence. Lose a case. The penalties ranged from fines calculated in silver arm rings to full outlawry, a sentence so severe it meant anyone could kill the condemned without repercussion. But here's what's truly remarkable. The Vikings recorded their laws in the landscape itself. Runestones across Scandinavia immortalize legal judgments, like the 8th century Rök stone in Sweden, which mentions a dispute over inheritance. In Denmark, the Glavendrup stone warns future generations not to disturb this grave or move these stones, adding a curse for violators, proof that law and myth were tightly woven. Even blood feuds, often romanticized as endless cycles of violence, had strict rules. The Gragars, Iceland's legal code, dictated everything from how many men could be summoned to a duel, no more than 2, to the exact compensation owed for a sliced-off ear, 12 ounces of silver. The contrast with their raider reputation couldn't be sharper. While Viking warbands certainly operated outside the law abroad, at home, order depended on consensus. No king ruled Iceland during its Viking age, just a patchwork of chieftains bound by shared rules. When a dispute arose in Norway, the accused might face trial by ordeal, like carrying red-hot iron. In Iceland, they'd argue their case before a jury of peers, with punishments designed to restore balance, not just inflict pain. Perhaps the most telling detail lies in the language. Old Norse had over 40 terms for different types of legal assemblies, from the Herthing army assembly to the Fjorðungsthing quarter court. This wasn't a society stumbling toward justice, it was one that debated it, polished it, and etched it into stone. So next time someone calls Vikings chaotic, remind them, the same people who raided Lindisfarne also crafted laws so enduring. Iceland's Althing still meets today, making it the oldest surviving parliament on earth. The Viking berserker, a figure so terrifying even their name means bear shirt in Old Norse, signaling the animal pelts they wore to channel supernatural fury. But behind the legends of warriors biting shields and laughing off mortal wounds lies a haunting question. Were these fighters in a drug-induced trance? The sagas describe berserkers entering battle in a state of uncontrollable rage, their eyes rolling back, bodies convulsing as if possessed. Some historians argue this wasn't just poetic exaggeration, it might have been chemistry. Take henbane, a plant found across Scandinavia with seeds containing scopolamine and hyoscyamine, potent hallucinogens. When ingested, they trigger delirium, heightened aggression, and even temporary insensitivity to pain symptoms eerily matching berserker descriptions. Archaeologists have found henbane seeds in Viking burial sites, including a grave in Firkat, Denmark, where a pouch of the seeds rested beside a warrior's weapons. Even more telling, medieval herbal texts describe Norse healers using henbane sparingly, warning that too much could steal a man's wits, but henbane isn't the only suspect. Fly agaric mushrooms with their bright red caps speckled white grow abundantly in Nordic birch forests. When consumed, they distort perception, amplify strength, and induce a dreamlike detachment effects that could explain saga accounts of berserkers fighting, as if in a dream. Siberian shamans used these mushrooms ceremonially, and Viking traders along the Volga River likely encountered similar practices. Could berserkers have borrowed the ritual? Then there's alcohol. The Unglinga saga claims Odin's elite warriors drank a mysterious Cirque's mead before battle, entering a frenzy immune to iron or flame. While mead alone wouldn't explain the extremes described, a potent brew laced with henbane or other botanicals might. Experimental archaeologist Neil Price recreated a possible berserker drink using fermented honey and henbane, reporting disorientation and heightened pain tolerance, though he notably refused to test it in combat. Critics counter that berserker behavior could be psychological, a mix of ritual conditioning and battlefield adrenaline. The sagas mention berserkers undergoing grueling initiation rites, like standing barehanded in freezing rivers or wrestling bears. Combine that with the hypnotic drumming of war chants and the sensory overload of clashing steel, and you've got a recipe for altered states without drugs. Perhaps the truth is a cocktail of both. Berserkers weren't just mindless brutes, they were specialists trained to weaponize altered consciousness. Whether through plants, ritual, or sheer will, they tapped into something primal, a force that turned men into legends and legends into nightmares. The next time you hear a berserker's roar in a Viking drama, remember, it might not have been just rage echoing across the battlefield, but the last whispers of a mind unmoored, riding the edge between myth and chemistry. Dig through a Viking grave and you're almost guaranteed to find one item: a comb. Not just any comb, but a meticulously crafted tool, often made from antler or bone, its teeth spaced with precision, its surface carved with interlocking beasts or geometric patterns. These weren't thrown in as afterthoughts, they were prized possessions placed beside warriors, merchants, and even children, as if grooming were a sacred rite. The Lufri comb, discovered in an Irish Viking burial, is a masterpiece, its handle shaped like a serpent, each tooth filed smooth over years of use. But here's what's fascinating: these combs weren't just vanity, they were survival gear. Take the dual-sided lice combs found across Norse settlements. One side had fine teeth for styling, the other with wider gaps, a practical tool for literally scraping parasites from hair and beards. Analysis under microscopes reveals tiny nits still lodged in the teeth of combs from York to Reykjavik, proof of a constant battle against infestations in close-quartered longhouses. But even these utilitarian objects were status symbols. A high-ranking Viking's comb might be adorned with silver inlay or runic inscriptions, while a thrall's would be plain, functional. The message was clear: how you cared for your body reflected your place in the world. Now, picture the hairstyles these combs crafted. Thanks to 3D reconstructions based on grave finds and tapestries, we know Viking men favored dramatic looks, shaved backs and sides with long top knots, sometimes braided or stiffened with wax into fierce crests. The ruse style, named for Viking traders in Eastern Europe, featured slicked back hair dyed bright red using henna or plant extracts. Women, meanwhile, wore intricate braids coiled into buns or left loose with decorative silk ribbons, a fashion so distinct that Byzantine chroniclers described Scandinavian women in Constantinople by their twisted golden ropes of hair. But grooming went beyond combs. Excavations in Dublin turned up ear spoons, tiny scoops for wax hung from belts like modern keys, nail cleaners fashioned from bronze. Even tweezers so finely made they rival modern designs. A 10th century trading post in Sweden yielded a mirror fragment alongside Scandinavian-style hairpins, suggesting Vikings weren't just cleaning up, they were curating appearances with near ritual precision. So why does this matter? Because every comb tells a story. A warrior buried with his might be signaling readiness for the afterlife's battles. A child's painstakingly repaired whispers of a parent's love. In a world often reduced to blood and axes, these small, ornate objects remind us Vikings didn't just conquer, they cared. Among the treasures buried in Viking hoards across Scandinavia, one discovery stands out: silver coins etched with flowing Arabic script. These weren't loot from raids, they were dirhams, the currency of the Islamic world, traveling thousands of miles along rivers and trade routes into Viking hands. But here's the twist: some of these coins bear scratches in runes, names like Allah and Muhammad clumsily carved beside pagan symbols. Evidence suggests a startling possibility: some Vikings didn't just trade with Muslims. They became Muslims. Take the 9th century accounts of Arab traveler Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who met Viking merchants on the Volga River. He described them as towering, tattooed figures who washed ritually before meals, a habit he found strikingly similar to Islamic ablutions. More telling are the graves. In Sweden's Birka cemetery, a woman was buried in traditional Norse dress, but her belt buckle held a silver ring inscribed with "For Allah" in Kufic script. Not a trophy, but a personal item worn smooth from use. Was she a convert, a trader's wife, or proof of deeper connections than we've imagined? The economic motive is undeniable. By the 10th century, the Islamic Caliphate was the richest market on earth, and Vikings craved its silver. To trade in cities like Baghdad or Constantinople, embracing local customs had advantages. Arabic sources mention Viking mercenaries serving as bodyguards for caliphs, some possibly taking oaths of allegiance that included conversion. A dirham found in Yorkshire even shows the Islamic declaration of faith, the Shahada overstruck with Thor's hammer, a symbolic fusion of both worlds. But this wasn't just pragmatism. At a time when Norse gods demanded blood sacrifices, Islam's ban on idolatry and emphasis on written scripture may have intrigued Viking traders accustomed to recording deeds in runes. The Gutta Saga, a medieval Scandinavian text, hints at this curiosity, describing a delegation sent to the land of the Greeks, the Byzantine Empire, to compare faiths. Some likely stayed, adopting new beliefs while keeping their axes close. The legacy lingers in language. Old Norse borrowed Arabic words like succor, sugar, and bagol, bishop's staff, while Viking scales balanced silver against Islamic weight standards. Even their burial customs shifted. Some graves in Russia face Mecca, their occupants laid to rest without weapons, a stark break from tradition. So were their Muslim Vikings. The coins whisper, yes, not as conquerors but as chameleons of faith, weaving Islam into their identity when it served them, proof that the Viking world was never just black and white, but shimmered with the colors of every shore they touched. Scattered across Denmark's landscape lie eerie, perfect circles, remnants of Viking engineering so precise they seem drawn by giants. These are the Trelleborg fortresses, colossal ring-shaped strongholds built with mathematical precision during the 10th century. The largest, at Agersborg, spans nearly 240 meters across, its circular rampart enclosing 16 longhouses arranged in 4 symmetrical quadrants like spokes on a wheel. From above, the geometry is staggering, ditches and walls forming concentric rings with gates aligned to the cardinal directions, all constructed to within inches of perfection using nothing but ropes and wooden stakes. This wasn't just architecture, it was warfare crystallized into soil and timber. What's baffling is the scale of coordination. Each Trelleborg, named after the first discovered in Esjeland, followed identical design principles, suggesting a centralized authority directing their construction. The walls weren't mere mounds, they were layered masterpieces, At Fiercat, excavators found alternating strata of soil, turf, and timber, creating structures so resilient they withstood sieges yet could be built in months. The secret Viking engineers used prefabrication. Timber was cut to uniform lengths off-site, then assembled like puzzle pieces, allowing armies to erect these floating fortresses wherever they anchored. But why circles? The shape eliminated blind spots, letting defenders rain arrows from any angle. More crucially, these weren't just military bases, they were psychological weapons. Imagine being a Saxon farmer watching a perfect geometric fortress rise in weeks, its symmetry defying nature. The message was clear: these were no disorganized raiders, but a force with discipline to match their fury. Their locations reveal another layer of genius. Trelleborg's guarded choke points. Augersborg commanded the Limfjord's narrowest stretch, controlling Baltic North Sea traffic, while Nonnebakken in Odense overlooked fertile plains ripe for taxation. Inside, the longhouses weren't barracks but rotating accommodations. Dendrochronology shows wood was reused as crews cycled through, suggesting mobile armies operating like a medieval rapid response force. The most haunting clue lies in their abandonment. By the 11th century, Trelleborgs were torched not by enemies but by their builders. Some archaeologists argue this was ritual destruction, a Norse tradition of closing sacred sites. Others see evidence of shifting power as Viking kings traded floating strongholds for stone castles. Either way, their legacy endures, blueprints for conquest, etched into the earth with a precision that still defies belief. These rings weren't just forts, they were the Viking war machine made visible, a declaration that wherever they landed, they'd reshape the world to their will. The flaming longship drifting into the night. It's the Viking funeral we all know from movies, but archaeology tells a very different story. While Arab chronicler Ahmad ibn Fadlan's vivid account of a chieftain's ship cremation on the Volga River is unforgettable, most Vikings met their end in ways far less cinematic. Across Scandinavia, thousands of burial mounds hide a quieter truth. The majority of Norse funerals involved no flames at all, just carefully arranged graves packed with clues about life, death, and the afterlife. Take the Oseberg ship burial in Norway. No fire touched this elegant vessel. Instead, two women, likely of royal status, were laid aboard their ornate ship, nestled with sledges, tapestries, and even a cart, all buried under a massive earthen mound to shelter their journey to the next world. Similar mound burials dot the landscape from Denmark to Iceland, their contents tailored to regional customs. In Sweden, warriors were often buried upright, spears in hand, facing east toward the rising sun. In Greenland's frozen soil, graves held seal blubber lamps still caked with soot, left burning to light the way through the long dark, the real shocker. Ibn Fadlan's account might be the exception, not the rule. His 10th century writings describe a Rus Viking chieftain's pyre where an enslaved girl volunteered to join her master in death, a spectacle so gruesome it seared itself into history. Yet forensic evidence suggests such elaborate send-offs were rare, reserved for the elite. Most Vikings rested in simple pits with grave goods reflecting their station. Blacksmiths with hammers, farmers with sickles, children with tiny amulets. At Lindholm Hoge in Denmark, over 700 graves form a ghostly fleet of stone ships, their outlines marking where the dead sailed symbolically into the afterlife. No flames required. What dictated these differences? Climate played a role. In Iceland's thin soil, cremation prevented animals from disturbing remains, while Norway's dense clay preserved ships intact for centuries. Status mattered too. A Danish king might rate a full ship burial like the Ladby vessel, its hull still cradling the bones of horses and dogs sacrificed to accompany him. But a fisherman's family, they'd likely be wrapped in wool and laid beneath a modest mound, their possessions, a well-worn knife, a polished whetstone, speaking of practicality, not pageantry. The most touching details emerge from children's graves. In Sweden's Birka, a young girl was buried with a miniature chair, perhaps to sit on in Valhalla. Elsewhere, infants clutch tiny glass beads, their cobalt blue sourced from as far as Mesopotamia, proof that even in death, Vikings connected worlds. So why does the burning ship myth endure? Because it captures the drama they revered, even if most took quieter paths. Their graves whisper this truth, whether by flame or earth. What mattered wasn't the spectacle, but the promise that no one sailed into the dark alone. If you think modern extreme food challenges are wild, the Vikings were doing it 1,000 years before YouTube dared them to. Meet Hakal fermented Greenland shark, a dish so pungent it's been described as eating ammonia-soaked gym socks with a side of regret. This wasn't just survival food, it was a delicacy, a test of courage, and a testament to Viking ingenuity in the face of scarcity. The process alone sounds like something from a horror story. Greenland shark meat is toxic when fresh, packed with urea and trimethylamine oxide chemicals that would literally burn your throat. So the Vikings buried it in gravel for 6 to 12 weeks, letting it rot just enough to break down the poisons, then hung it to dry for months until it hardened into leathery, stinking cubes. The result, a snack so potent it's traditionally washed down with brennivin, a schnapps nicknamed Black Death, just to numb the senses. Today, Hakal is Iceland's national dish, served in tiny bites to brave tourists. Celebrity chefs like Anthony Bourdain called it the single worst thing I've ever put in my mouth, while locals swear by its earthy aftertaste. But here's the kicker, this wasn't an outlier in Viking cuisine. They thrived on foods that would make most modern palates revolt. In Greenland, excavations uncovered pits of fermented seal flippers, a dish still eaten in parts of the Arctic. The meat is sealed in sealskin bags and left to ferment until it reaches a gelatinous, sour consistency, often described as chewing on a sour, fishy sponge. Then there's Esvid, sheep's head singed to remove wool, boiled until the eyeballs turn gelatinous, and served with the brain scooped out like a delicacy. Or Blothmer, a sausage made by stuffing sheep's blood, fat, and oats into a stomach casing. These weren't just eccentric recipes, they were born of necessity. In a climate where winters could last 8 months, fermentation and preservation weren't choices, they were lifelines. A single rotting shark could feed a family for weeks, its high protein content sustaining them through ice-locked fjords. What's fascinating is how these foods reveal Viking adaptability. They didn't just endure harsh conditions, they weaponized them, turning spoilage into flavor. Even their bread was pragmatic. Hrökbröð, or earthquake bread, was baked underground using geothermal heat, a technique still used in Iceland's hot springs. So next time you wince at a durian fruit or blue cheese, remember, the Vikings were out here feasting on putrid shark like it was gourmet, proving once again that their true superpower wasn't just strength, it was stomach. Runes weren't just letters scratched onto wood or stone, they were living spells, pulsing with the power to curse enemies, heal wounds, or even bind hearts. Take the towering Björketorp stone in Sweden, its surface carved with a warning that still sends chills down the spine. I conceal here the runes of power. Incessant plague and endless death await the one who breaks this monument. This wasn't bravado. To the Vikings, words etched in runes weren't just messages, they were incantations capable of shaping reality itself. The magic hinged on a simple but profound belief. The act of carving runes summoned the forces they represented. A warrior might ink Tyr as the rune of Tyr, god of war, onto his blade to guarantee victory, while a mother could carve Berkana, the rune of birch and renewal, near a sick child's bed. But the real artistry lay in Bindrune's intricate fusions of multiple runes into a single symbol, amplifying their power. A 9th century amulet from Denmark twists Alge's protection and Daga's breakthrough into a swirling emblem, likely worn into battle as a talisman against death. Archaeology reveals even more intimate magic. In Norway's Sigtuna, a bone fragment bears a love spell. May you walk restless, unable to sleep until you return to me. The runes are cramped, almost frenzied, as if carved in desperate hope. Elsewhere, protective charms abound, a lead plate from Ribe inscribed with runes to guard against fever, a wooden stave from Bergen cursed to rot a thief's hands. Even everyday objects got enchanted. A spinning wall from Orkney carries the rune Fehu, symbolizing wealth, perhaps to ensure the wool spun would bring prosperity. The most haunting examples blur the line between prayer and threat. The Rök stone in Sweden, the longest runic inscription ever found, doesn't just recount heroics. It seems to recite a cryptic incantation about lighting and darkness, possibly to avert a coming catastrophe. Some scholars believe these passages weren't just poetry. They were spells cast in stone, meant to hold back famine or winter. What's striking is how personal these runes could be. A tiny silver pendant from Birka shows a woman's name, Ali, entwined with Jibo, the rune of partnership, less a label than a plea for connection. On the flip side, a Swedish runestone curses a man who broke his oath to the gods, his betrayal now eternally etched for passers-by to scorn. This wasn't superstition, it was a system. Rune masters, often women, trained for years to wield these symbols correctly. A botched rune could backfire. One saga tells of a carver who misplaced a stroke, turning a healing charm into a death sentence. The power wasn't just in the shapes but in the materials. Amber runes for fertility, blood red garnet for courage, bone for messages to the dead. Every detail held weight. So the next time you see runes in a museum, don't just read them, listen. That whisper you hear isn't the wind. It's the echo of 1,000 voices, still praying, cursing, loving, and warning across the centuries, their words sharp as the daggers they once carried. Digging up Viking-era stables reveals a surprise. These famed warriors rode horses no bigger than modern ponies. Skeletal remains from sites like Birka and Hedeby show most Norse steeds stood barely 13 hands high, with sturdy legs and thick necks built for endurance, not speed. This wasn't a limitation, it was strategy. Smaller horses could navigate icy fjord trails and rocky mountain passes where larger breeds would falter, their compact bodies conserving energy on long raids. A study of equine bones in Iceland found distinct where patterns suggesting Vikings rode them hard over uneven terrain, their hooves striking the ground with the steady rhythm of a people always on the move. Yet in their myths, horses soared to godly proportions. Sleipnir, Odin's 8-legged stallion, could gallop between worlds, his extra limbs symbolizing unstoppable motion, a metaphor for Viking ambitions. The poetic Edda describes him swift as the wind that shreds clouds, carrying Odin to the land of the dead and back. Real-life Vikings mirrored this reverence. At the famous Oseberg ship burial, 2 decapitated horses were arranged as if ready to pull their noble rider into the afterlife. Other graves include horseshoe-shaped amulets and bridles adorned with Thor's hammers, blurring the line between steed and sacred companion. The most chilling evidence comes from Trelleborg, where a pit held the skeletons of 15 horses, all slaughtered in a single event, their bones bearing cut marks from ritual blade strokes. This wasn't mere sacrifice, it was spectacle. Norse sagas describe blot ceremonies where horses were dedicated to Freya, god of fertility, their blood sprinkled on idols and participants. Afterward, the meat was cooked and shared in feasts meant to bind communities to the divine. But here's the twist, these small horses left a colossal legacy. Modern Icelandic horses, direct descendants of Viking imports, still carry DNA proving they've remained purebred for 1,000 years, no larger, no improved. To ride one today is to feel a living thread to the past. Their smooth-turled gait, a 5th speed unique to the breed, may have been the secret to covering vast distances without tiring riders. So next time you picture a Viking charge, forget Hollywood's towering stallions. The real heroes were knee-high, tough as iron, and just as vital to forging an empire. Beneath the flickering light of a Viking longhouse, warriors hunched over a wooden board, their fingers hovering not over weapons but over carved game pieces. This wasn't just entertainment, it was H. Nefertafel, a game of strategy so revered that kings and raiders alike sharpened their minds on its checkered battlefield. Unlike chess, which pits equal armies against each other, Nefertafel was asymmetrical, a reflection of the Viking world itself. One player commanded a king and his defenders, outnumbered but positioned at the board's center, while the other controlled a larger force of attackers, their goal to swarm and capture the royal peace. The rules, lost to time, have been painstakingly reconstructed from fragmentary sagas and archaeological finds, revealing a game that mirrored the Vikings' love of cunning over brute force. Excavated game pieces tell their own story. In the Isle of Lewis hoard, alongside iconic chessmen, lay Nefertafel pieces, some ornate, like the king carved from walrus ivory with a furrowed brow, others plain and worn from years of play. A board discovered in Norway's Gokstad ship burial was scratched with a grid, its edges darkened by generations of fingertips. The pieces themselves varied: simple pebbles in common households, elaborate glass beads in aristocratic halls, even repurposed jewelry in a pinch. What mattered wasn't the material, but the strategy. Sagas describe games lasting hours, stakes escalating from silver rings to parcels of land, the tension thick enough to slice with a six. The genius of Nefertafel lay in its imbalance. The king's side, though outnumbered, could win by escaping to the board's edge, a nod to real Viking tactics where small bands often outmaneuvered larger foes through guile. Attackers, meanwhile, had to coordinate like a raiding party, cutting off escape routes. Scholars compare it to Go, where territory matters more than casualties. A 12th century Welsh text even references a nearly identical game called Tafel, suggesting Vikings may have adapted it from earlier cultures, then made it their own. But Nefertafel wasn't just training for war, it was a social glue. At feasts, games settled disputes without bloodshed. In Iceland's Althing, chieftains reportedly played to negotiate treaties, their moves speaking louder than oaths. Even children learned it. A wooden board from York, small enough to fit in a palm, bears the scratches of a beginner's hesitant plays. The most haunting evidence comes from graves. At Balladul on the Isle of Man, a warrior was buried with his Nefertafel pieces arranged mid-game, as if death were merely his opponent's turn. It's a silent testament to what the Vikings truly valued, not just strength, but the ability to think 3 moves ahead in a world where every decision could mean glory or ruin. So next time you play chess, remember 1,000 years ago, someone was plotting a different kind of checkmate, their fingers tracing the same desperate paths between survival and conquest. Far from the fjords of Scandinavia, Viking warriors carved their legacy into the sun-baked walls of Constantinople's grandest palaces as elite bodyguards to Byzantine emperors. These were the Varangian Guard, an elite brotherhood of Norse mercenaries whose loyalty was bought not with land, but with gold and glory. The proof lies in runestones scattered across Sweden, like the one at Ed boasting. Havard carved these runes in memory of his son Erndot, who died in the south in the land of the Greeks. That land of the Greeks was Byzantium, where Viking axes became the last line of defense for history's most dazzling empire. The journey east was no accident. By the 10th century, Constantinople was the wealthiest city on earth, its coffers overflowing with silk and silver. Viking traders had long navigated the Dnieper River to reach its markets, but the emperors saw potential in these towering foreigners. Unlike local guards swayed by political factions, Norsemen had no ties to Byzantine intrigue, just a lust for wages paid in pure gold nomisma coins. The Alexiad, a medieval chronicle, describes them as axe-bearing barbarians whose mere presence silenced plotters. One emperor, Basil II, hired 6,000 Vikings after they helped crush a rebellion in 988, their two-handed axes cleaving through enemy lines like iron harvesters. What made the Varangians indispensable wasn't just their brutality, it was their rituals. Upon enlistment, they swore oaths on a sacred sword, binding them to the emperor alone. Their hall in Constantinople had a Norse name, Palladium, echoing the mead halls of home. When not on duty, they drank from Byzantine goblets engraved with runes, blending cultures in ways that still baffle historians. A 12th century text recounts how guards celebrated a victory by hoisting their emperor onto a shield and chanting in Old Norse, a coronation right straight from Scandinavia. The runestones back home whisper of these adventures. The Gripsholm stone in Sweden memorializes a warrior who went east with Ingvar, likely referencing a doomed 11th century expedition to the Caspian Sea. Others flaunt wealth. Tola had this stone raised for her son Harold, who earned gold in Greece. That gold wasn't metaphorical. Archaeologists have found Byzantine coins melted into Norse arm rings, proof that Varangians repatriated fortunes. Yet the darkest tales never made it onto stone. The Varangian who served as executioner for Emperor Romanus IV, chopping off his rival's hands with a single stroke. The guards who looted Constantinople's churches during a coup in 1204, carrying off relics like common thieves. Even their end was ironic. The guards' last members were English exiles after the Norman conquest, Saxons fighting under a Norse banner far from home. To stand in the great palace today is to stand where Vikings once paced, their shadows stretching across marble floors. They came as mercenaries but left as legends, their saga etched not just in runestones but in the very DNA of empires. Walk through the ruins of Ribe, Denmark's oldest Viking town, and you'll find something shocking: neatly aligned property lines, drainage ditches, and workshops spaced with precision. This wasn't some haphazard camp. It was a carefully planned urban center, its streets humming with traders from Baghdad to Dublin. The myth of Vikings as disorganized raiders crumbles here, where 8th century town plots were measured out with ropes and stakes, each artisan's booth assigned its place like pieces on a Nefertafel board. Archaeologists mapping the site found leatherworking stalls consistently positioned downwind of forges, while fish-drying racks line the riverbank for easy access, proof that Viking urban planning wasn't just functional, it was downright scientific. Hedeby, the bustling trade hub near modern Schleswig, took it further. Imagine a grid of wooden streets radiating from a central marketplace, warehouses stocked with Baltic amber and Samarkand silk, even raised walkways to keep feet dry during floods. Recent laser scans reveal plots subdivided into standard 60-foot modules, suggesting a governing body enforced zoning rules. One excavation uncovered a perfectly preserved street with ruts from cartwheels spaced precisely 4 feet apart, evidence of traffic management in an era when most European towns were glorified mud puddles. Reconstructions at the Hedeby Viking Museum bring this sophistication to life. Multi-story longhouses with peaked roofs crowd the waterfront, their doors opening onto boardwalks instead of dirt paths. A scale model shows the town's hidden infrastructure: underground culverts diverting rainwater, smithies clustered near the main gate to control sparks, even a designated stinking lane where tanners processed hides downwind. Far from the feral image of fur-clad berserkers, these were people who debated property lines and noise ordinances. The contrast with contemporary Europe couldn't be starker. While Parisians dumped chamber pots into the Seine and London streets dissolved into sludge, Viking towns had graded gravel roads repaired seasonally. At Birka in Sweden, grave goods included folding brass scales so precise they could measure to the gram, tools of merchants, not marauders. Even their suburbs showed forethought. York's Coppergate district, settled by Norse traders, had property boundaries unchanged for 2 centuries, passed down like heirlooms. Why does this matter? Because every straight street and planned workshop whispers the same truth. The Vikings didn't just loot civilizations, they built them. Behind the dragon prows and axe blows lay minds that could orchestrate a town as deftly as a raid, proving chaos wasn't in their nature, only in their enemies' nightmares. The Viking afterlife wasn't a one-size-fits-all paradise. It was a sprawling cosmic neighborhood with destinations tailored to how you lived, died, and even the company you kept. At the top of the hierarchy stood Valhalla, Odin's glittering hall where warriors slain in battle feasted and fought eternally. But here's the twist: Valhalla wasn't the only option, nor was it reserved solely for Scandinavians. The sagas hint at a surprisingly inclusive system. A fallen warrior from any land, whether Irish, Saxon, or Slavic, could earn a seat at Odin's table if they fought bravely enough. Then there was Hell's realm, often misunderstood as a Norse version of Hell. Unlike the Christian underworld, Hell's domain wasn't a pit of fire but a shadowy reflection of life itself, a place where farmers, mothers, and the elderly continued their routines in misty fields and echoing halls. The prose Edda describes it as a vast hall named Iljudnir, where Hel herself, the half-blue daughter of Loki, served meals on a dish called hunger and a knife named famine. This wasn't punishment, it was simply where most souls went, regardless of virtue. But the afterlife got even more specialized. Sailors who drowned might find themselves in Ron's underwater hall, where the sea goddess and her 9 daughters collected the drowned in her vast net. Fishermen's graves often included small boats or oars, not just for symbolic journeys, but perhaps to navigate these watery depths. Meanwhile, those who died at sea under dishonorable circumstances, like thieves or oath breakers, were said to wash up on the corpse shore, a desolate beach where the dead were left to rot under the watch of the giant Atrium. The most poetic destination belonged to lovers. The goddess Freyja claimed half the battle dead for her field of Folkvanga, where reunions with lost partners were said to be as sweet as mead. Grave goods tell haunting stories: a woman buried in Sweden with a bronze brooch from Ireland, perhaps hoping to find its far-traveled giver again, or a pair of skeletons clasping hands in a Danish grave, their fingers fused by time. Even children had their place. The Gylfaginning mentions a hall called Bilskirnir, where Thor welcomed those who died young, ensuring no soul was left wandering. Toys buried with them, tiny horses, miniature swords, suggest parents believed their little ones would play on in another world. The brilliance of this system. It mirrored Viking society's practicality. Just as their towns had spaces for warriors, traders, and craftsmen, the afterlife had rooms for every fate. A farmer who never lifted a sword could still feast with ancestors in Hell's halls, while a warrior's end wasn't just an honor, it was a job interview for eternity. And in a world where death could come by storm, blade, or childbirth, having a destination for every journey made the unknown feel a little less vast. The Vikings didn't just believe in an afterlife, they built a multiverse of it, ensuring no one, not even the drowned or the dishonored, had to face the dark alone. High on a windswept plain in Iceland, a fissure in the earth splits the landscape like a giant's axe stroke. This is Thingvellir, where for over 3 centuries, Viking lawmakers gathered beneath open skies to debate, settle feuds, and shape one of history's most radical experiments in self-rule. What's astonishing isn't just that these meetings happened, it's that you can still stand on the exact volcanic rock where speakers addressed the crowd, touch the same cliffs that amplified their voices, and walk the same paths trodden by farmers turned judges 1,000 years ago. The whole thing wasn't just a parliament, it was theater of democracy staged by nature itself. Picture the scene each summer from 9:30 onward. Chieftains arriving from across Iceland with their retinues, setting up woolen tents along the Irksara River. Free men, yes, even some women gathered around the Lurgberg or Law Rock, a natural podium where the law speaker would recite 1/3 of the island's entire legal code from memory each year. No scribes, no parchment, just the collective memory of a people determined to govern themselves. The ground here is uneven, studded with rocks that forced attendees to constantly shift positions, a physical reminder that consensus required effort. The genius of the system lay in its simplicity. Iceland had no king, no standing army. Instead, 36 chieftains brought their followers to Thingvellir, where disputes were settled by juries of neighbors. Murder cases hinged on witness testimony and oath swearing, with fines calculated in silver ounces to avoid blood feuds. Even the landscape conspired to help. The Almanacjor Canyon's basalt walls acted as a Chinese letter amplifier, carrying voices across the assembly. Archaeologists have found fragments of gaming pieces and dice near the site, likely used to pass judgment hours, as today's jurors might flip through magazines. But here's what's truly groundbreaking: the All Things legacy didn't vanish with the Vikings. When Denmark granted Iceland home rule in 1874, leaders deliberately revived the ancient assembly's name for their new parliament. Today's Icelandic lawmakers still gather annually at Thingvellir for symbolic sessions, standing where their ancestors did. The Law Rock, now a UNESCO site, has hosted concerts and protests, proving that some stones never lose their voice. Compare this to medieval Europe, where most justice was meted out in castle halls or church courts. While English nobles wrangled over Magna Carta in 1215, Icelandic farmers had been refining participatory governance for 200 years. The All Thing wasn't perfect. Powerful families often swayed verdicts. An outlawry could be a death sentence, but its spirit endures. Visitors today report something eerie about the place. The way wind whistles through the canyon sounds almost like murmured debates, as if the land itself remembers every oath sworn and every case resolved. So next time someone claims democracy was born in Athens, remind them that Vikings perfected it under open skies on a rock that still calls the faithful to assembly. The real magic of Thingvellir isn't just in its history, it's in the unbroken thread connecting those first loud arguments over sheep theft to the chatter of modern tourists, all united by the radical idea that even in the age of axes, words could be mightier than blades. The Vikings didn't just conquer lands, they conquered stains. In the bustling trade towns of Hedeby and Birka, archaeologists uncovered something unexpected. Deep pits filled with aged human urine, their pungent contents once the secret ingredient behind Scandinavia's whitest linens and softest leathers. This wasn't mere waste disposal, it was a chemical revolution. When left to ferment, urine breaks down into ammonia, a natural bleaching agent powerful enough to strip grime from wool and transform yellowed fabrics into bright trade goods. The proof lies in textile fragments from Dublin's Fishamble Street, where microscopic analysis revealed traces of urea crystals, telltale signs of a Viking laundry day that would make modern detergents blush. But ammonia's magic didn't stop at laundry. Tanneries across the Viking world relied on urine baths to soften raw hides into supple leather. A 10th century workshop in York contained vats layered with oak bark and urine, where hides soaked for weeks until the collagen fibers broke down. The process was so foul that sagas referenced tanners working downwind of settlements, yet the results were indispensable: armor straps, ship rigging, and even those iconic fur-trimmed boots depended on urine's alchemy. The real ingenuity lay in scale. At Ribes Market District, excavations revealed communal pea pits positioned near dying vats, suggesting an organized collection system. Families likely contributed to these reservoirs daily, turning a bodily function into a commodity. Some pits even show evidence of lime additives to accelerate ammonia production, a crude but effective form of chemical engineering. What's striking is how this resourcefulness mirrored Viking values. Where others saw waste, they saw potential. Even their laws reflected this. The Gulatingslov from Norway imposed fines for stealing urine from tannery vats, placing it on par with theft of salt or iron. In a world without synthetic chemicals, survival meant seeing value everywhere, even in what most cultures flushed away. So next time you spritz stain remover on a shirt, remember, the Vikings were doing it 1,000 years earlier with a far more personal touch. That ancestry test you took last year might hold a Viking surprise. Genetic studies reveal nearly 10% of the population in the UK and Ireland carries Scandinavian DNA, meaning if you have roots in these regions, odds are 1 in 10 that a Norse raider or trader lurks in your family tree. But here's what's staggering. The reach extends far beyond the usual suspects. In a 2020 study published in Nature, researchers analyzing over 16,000 DNA samples found Viking genetic markers as far south as Spain and Sicily, with clusters along the coasts of France and Portugal. Even more unexpected, parts of Poland show stronger Norse genetic links than some regions of Denmark, proof that Viking influence wasn't just about raids but deep cultural exchange. Take the Orkney Islands, where a whopping 25% of male lineages trace back to Norwegian settlers. Geneticists identified a distinct Y chromosome haplogroup, RM405, that spikes dramatically in these regions, a silent echo of Viking warlords who overwintered with local families. But it's not just men. Mitochondrial DNA from Viking-era female skeletons in Norway matches maternal lines in Scotland's Outer Hebrides, suggesting Norse women weren't just left behind. They sailed, settled, and passed their genes through generations. The math gets personal. Companies like Ancestry DNA estimate that over 6 million living Americans have Scandinavian ancestry, many unaware of the connection. One viral Reddit thread detailed how a man from Oklahoma discovered his great-great-grandmother's lineage led straight to a Viking chieftain buried near Dublin, confirmed by a shared rare genetic mutation. Another traced their family's chronic pain condition to a mutation first identified in Viking remains, a bizarre inheritance from some long-ago warrior. Why does this matter? Because these genes aren't just historical footnotes, they're active players in modern health. Studies link Viking-descended populations to higher rates of Dupuytren's contracture, a hand condition jokingly called Viking disease, and a greater tolerance for lactose traits that may have helped Norse settlers thrive in dairy-rich regions like Normandy and Yorkshire. So how do you spot Viking heritage without a test? Look for surnames ending in son or sen, or place names with by, Old Norse for village, but the real proof is in your cells. When a team sequenced DNA from a 1,000-year-old Viking grave in Sweden, they found matching markers in living people across England, some as close as third cousins separated by centuries. That's the wildest twist of all. The Vikings didn't just leave behind swords and ships. They left themselves hidden in the blood of millions who'll never hear a longship's creak but carry its legacy in every heartbeat. So let's set the record straight. The Vikings weren't just horned, helmeted brutes howling into battle. They were navigators who crossed oceans with sunstones sharper than modern GPS, lawmakers who built the world's oldest parliament, and poets who carved love spells into bone. They traded from Baghdad to Newfoundland, brewed ammonia-powered laundry detergent, and even had a goddess who rode chariots pulled by cats. Forget the Hollywood caricatures. These were people who turned urine into bleach, toy ships into training manuals, and fermented shark into a delicacy. The real shock isn't just how much we got wrong, it's how much we're still uncovering. Every archaeological dig flips another stereotype: the Burqa warrior woman, the Muslim convert's ring, the legal codes recited from memory under open skies. The Vikings didn't just leave ruins, they left blueprints for living. Survival tactics, egalitarian courts, and a knack for turning chaos into order. Here's the takeaway: history's never one note. Behind every cliché of axe-wielding raiders, there's a deeper truth of inventors, explorers, and yes, even clean freaks who probably smelled better than their European neighbors. So the next time someone reduces Vikings to a punchline about pillaging, hit them with the facts. If this deep dive into Viking secrets surprised you, do us a favor. Smash that like button, subscribe for more myth-busting history, and drop a comment below. Which secret blew your mind the most? Was it the sunstone navigation, the democratic assemblies, or the fact that they beat Columbus to America by 500 years? Share your favorite, and let's keep the conversation going.